All right, you ready to jump into some questions here?
Yeah, we were talking about the differences between in that Mark passage, and there is a difference. So,
Okay, let's
yeah.
start with that. All right, Nick has a question, and he says this. In Mark chapter 1, verses 40 through 45, could you please explain the Greek versions of this passage? Was Jesus indignant or compassionate, and does it matter?
Well, does it matter? I think it matters because obviously there's a difference between being indignant or compassionate. Indignant
Sure.
has to do with being angry about something. Compassionate obviously has to do with having a heart for the person that's standing in front of you. And so in for example. One of the newer translations, it would read, if you will, basically it says a leper came to Jesus, and I'm putting that word in, imploring him and kneeling said to him, if you will, you can make me clean. And the ESV says here, moved with pity, he stretched out his hand and touched him and said to him, I will be clean. And immediately the leprosy left. And the passage goes on there. In New King James, it says pretty much the same thing in the English translation. It says in that passage in verse 41, then Jesus, moved with compassion, stretched out his hand and touched him and said to him, I'm willing, be cleansed. Now here's a difference between the two passages. One passage in the ESV says pity, and the other one says moved with compassion. The problem is that in the ESV, the word in Greek is not the word for pity. It's the word that means to be, actually, it's, or, let me look at it, orgistheis, and it comes from orgizomai, and orge is the word for wrath, literally. And so that's a word that means to be full of anger, to be furious, to be angry. And so, then the question would be, which word is it? And that has to do with, your attitude towards the Greek texts. I think we've talked about this a couple of different times. But
Which one was the pity one, the ESV?
the ESV has pity there.
Sorry.
In fact, I'm sitting here, you guys, looking at my Bible program, doing comparisons here. This needs to stop it. It's not going to stop. Let me. I'm messing with my Bible program here. Just a second. So, New King James says that Jesus was moved with compassion. King James says Jesus was moved with compassion. ESV says Jesus was moved with pity, and like I said before, that's they're translating that from the Greek word for anger, actually, or for wrath. Let me do this in another place here. My computer's locking up, you guys. Sorry. Oh, it's going to do this to me. Okay. In any case, there are two different Greek words in that passage when you're looking at the original Greek. One of the things that you have with the ESV and some of the other modern versions is that what they're doing is they're going with the Greek that's used in a King James or a New King James, despite the fact that the Greek that's used in their translation is something that's different. And so again, in Greek, the word for compassion for King James, New King James is going to be a word that actually means compassion, and the word that's used in NIV, New American Standard, ESV, all of the more modern versions is going to be a word that comes from the word wrath. They just happen to translate it compassion or pity or or those kinds of things. And so what the translators are letting you know in translating it that way is that they don't agree with the Greek word. And that's a pretty unusual thing. And in fact, I can't remember another place where I've seen that. In fact, I didn't even know about it in this passage until I pulled up my Greek and started looking at it. And so that's pretty surprising. Usually there'll be some reference here. I think that the Greek translators for the NIV and the NASB and so on are correct. Obviously, Jesus isn't going to be indignant with a guy who's asking to be made clean. Mm-hmm. And so I don't think that that's probably going to be it wouldn't be a good translation, but I don't think that the text is right there in the more modern Greek text. And just to let you know what's going on, and I don't want to make this a big fat Greek lesson, but basically there are two types of texts that are used to translate your New Testament. And so for most of the modern versions of the New Testament, they're using what's called an eclectic text, and they're trying to take the Greek from a number of ancient Greek Bibles. And so they have different names, Sinaiticus, Vaticanus, and Alexandrinus. And they have the benefit of being the earliest Greek texts that we have of the New Testament. Normally, earlier would be better. And when I was first looking at this issue, that's what I thought. But then I found out that we have some copies of letters by church fathers where they use pretty much even up a version that comes from a King James or a New King James, or a version that would come from like an NIV. And so the question as to which Greek text is the best, a lot of times when you go to modern seminaries, they all come down on the side of what's called the eclectic text, where they take it from those three manuscripts. But that issue is far from over as far as the truth of the whole issue. And the truth, when you look at the situation, the vast majority of texts of the Greek read like a New King James or a King James version. And so there's only a very few of them that read differently than a King James or a New King James version, and those don't agree with each other. And I just have problems with that. And so this would be one of those places where I would default to the text that's behind the King James or the New King James, and apparently the translators have too, despite the fact that the word's different in Greek. And again, I don't usually see that, but that translation, pity, in the ESV is not the word that's used there. That's interesting. Thanks for bringing that to my attention. But I would definitely go with the text behind a New King James rather than the other. So,
all right, Nick. Hopefully that answers your question. Thanks for posting, man. Appreciate it. So, and again, you already pointed out we could talk the whole show about this and then some. But one of the things when I got saved is understanding where we got our Bible, and obviously you have to go back to like the original manuscripts and the stuff that we have to get the Bible.
Yeah.
So there's like some boring books, like Canon of Scripture by F.F. Bruce and stuff that are really good for people to go through. But what I've seen, and correct me if I'm wrong, but
that's me. Sorry.
Is there's like this breed of liberal scholars, and I don't know if this is like a normal thing or if it's just something that's on the scene or if it's a reform. I don't know. But like I went through Hebrews and I'm going through Romans and I'm seeing stuff and I'm like, man, this really looks like Paul to me. Like Romans 12 and Hebrews 13, I'm looking at stuff going, he's talking about this, like his outline's the same. And then I look into it, and of course we don't technically know the writer of Hebrews, but there's all these people that say that Paul didn't write Hebrews. When in the beginning in the church, it says, Paul was the author of Hebrews, and then it kind of changed. And so I go through and I read their arguments, and a lot of them are based off of nothing.
Right.
And all of a sudden it's changed, and they're, I don't know, these theologians that go into the Greek and stuff, they do these weird games, but I try and read their arguments, but it's like their arguments are based off of nothing.
Yeah.
And there's this huge push that's getting more and more liberal, and now we're coming up with stuff, that gets, I think, crazy.
Yeah.
Like Jesus seminar stuff and all this stuff. It's like, what are you talking about when it comes to the scholar stuff? I don't know if that makes sense, but that's something I was going through lately that has to do with, the manuscripts from the original. And it's interesting. It seems like there's this swing going that way.
Well, that swing is like a pendulum. It goes back and forth.
Okay.
What happens though is the liberal viewpoint starts getting more and more prominent, and so the reason that we're even having the discussion about the Greek text is because there was a revision in the 1880s where they were going to revise the translation of the King James, update the wording, and a couple of scholars got in there who are demonstrably not Christians because of specifically their beliefs on who Jesus is and the nature of salvation and that kind of thing. And they swayed the committee into putting way too much weight on these early manuscripts. And there were some scholars at the time who made a big ruckus about the whole thing. But what you had was a period of time there from the 1880s to probably about the 1920s where most of the seminaries and the scholarship was leaning in that direction. And based on some of the theories, the two guys are called Westcott and Hort. And based on their theories, and basically their idea was that the Bible had been edited, and that sometime between the writings of these manuscripts, which are from the 300s and the 400s, sometime after the 400s, there'd been this big push in the church to bring all the texts together and do a revision, and that was supposedly their explanation for the fact that the vast majority of Greek texts read exactly the same, and they read like an actual Greek writer wrote them. They have good grammar, good spelling, that kind of thing, which lets you know that the earliest manuscripts that these guys are taking this stuff from have bad grammar and bad spelling, and again, they don't agree with each other. And so that was their explanation of why that was the case. And so you have a whole group of scholars who believe that a text with bad spelling, bad Greek, bad grammar, that whole thing is an indication that you've got an earlier text. And the part of the reason that they say things like that is because Paul wasn't necessarily a Greek speaker,
right?
And so he had an amanuensis who would write his epistles as he spoke them. And so these guys would write down the Greek. And so if Paul's ever writing in Greek, then it's going to be bad Greek. And same thing with Peter. If Peter's ever writing in Greek, it's going to be bad Greek and that kind of thing. As if these guys don't learn over time. Because when you're looking at many of these writings, whether you're talking about Paul or whether you're talking about Peter, they're decades after the time of Jesus. So can Peter learn Greek? I don't know. Maybe. And can Paul learn Greek? I don't know, maybe.
Yeah. Well, look at Paul's background. That guy is, I don't want to label him an intellectual, but he went from the Sanhedrin, which requires a certain intellect to be a Jew and learn all that stuff and work your way up. He got saved. The guy's not a dummy.
Right. I would absolutely label the guy an intellectual. I spend my time in the Word of God all the time, and one of the things that I do is I go through whole books of the Bible when I'm teaching, and I outline them. And so when I'm going through Paul's epistles, every word in the first parts of Paul's epistles, every concept that he brings up, he illustrates and expands on later on in the epistle. And you have to remember that he's doing this from memory.
Right.
He's dictating this to a guy who's writing it down. It's amazing structure.
Yeah.
For a guy who's doing dictation.
Mm-hmm.
And so the guy's a genius, as far as I'm concerned. So yeah, I think he's an intellectual, and he sat under the feet of Gamaliel,
right.
who was a Jewish, again, intellectual. He was a rabbi, but he wasn't an intellectual. And so you have that. And so saying that bad Greek and bad spelling is an indication of an earlier text is making an assumption for no good reason. and again, it's one of those things that people do, and then they make a big thing out of it without ever proving the point. Since those days, and I was talking about up until the 1920s or so. I don't know if I have my dates exactly right. It may be a little bit later. But the whole idea of an editorial board that smoothed out the text has gone out the door. Nobody believes that anymore. But that was the basis of using those three texts. And so basically what's happened is the recension, the revision has become a fait accompli in the sense that they've moved over to this thinking about the Greek text, and all the arguments that was used for moving over to the thinking about the Greek text have been disproved and dismantled and thrown out the door. And the modern guys who follow this theory don't even believe it anymore. And on top of that, what's been happening for the last 140 years or so, what's been happening is that text that it's called an eclectic text because they're taking stuff and putting it all together. That text has been moving steadily towards the text that is represented in the King James and the New King James. So where there have been differences, they've been steadily, those differences have been steadily moving back towards what's called the majority text. And so they're seeing it, and this would be a place where they saw it. And they didn't change the word, though, but they did change the translation. That's interesting. That's not a good thing. That's not the way that's supposed to go.
So for people that are watching, like when it comes down to that stuff, maybe if they're a new believer, we're not talking about anything as far as salvation, Jesus rising from the dead, the resurrection, any of the hardcore stuff. We're talking about minute details that, whether Jesus' attitude in this verse, it's very important, I think, but it's not going to change our doctrine in the sense of
doesn't change the story, doesn't change the fact that Jesus performed a miracle, doesn't change the fact that Jesus was compassionate. If it had said indignation, if I was teaching through that, I would say that he's probably indignant about the fact of sin in the world and the results of sin, being disease and that kind of thing. But yes, it does make a difference, and I was really surprised with the ESV translating that pity. Because it's not the word pity, that doesn't usually happen. So
okay. I'd talk a lot longer on that, but we'd probably be down to like 2 people watching.
Yeah.